Have you ever imagined being lost in the middle of the desert, with the scorching sun beating down on you, and then being saved by a mysterious stranger? In today's story, you'll follow Ryan, a young American adventurer, as he finds himself stranded in the vast, unforgiving sands of the Middle East. His luck takes a surprising turn when he is rescued by an enigmatic and breathtakingly handsome Arab man named Zayn, riding a powerful and majestic camel. What begins as a desperate rescue soon unfolds into a night of unexpected connection, romance, and emotional discovery under the stars. This is a story of survival, passion, and finding intimacy in the unlikeliest of places. Stay with us until the very end. You won't want to miss how Ryan's adventure transforms into a life-changing experience. If you enjoy stories of love, courage, and the beauty of unexpected connections, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications to never miss another incredible tale like this. Now, let's dive into the story. In the desert, he showed me something gigantic. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a vast ocean of golden dunes under a blistering sun. My name is Ryan, and this wasn't supposed to happen. I had come to the Middle East seeking adventure, a chance to escape my mundane life back home. The desert tour I'd booked seemed harmless, a half-day trek into the sands with a group of travelers. But somehow, I'd wandered too far from the group, and now I was utterly and hopelessly lost. The searing heat was relentless. My lips were cracked, my throat parched, and my body felt weak from the unforgiving sun. My water bottle had run dry hours ago, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. The once beautiful dunes now seemed like mountains, their beauty overshadowed by the panic rising in my chest. I tried to stay calm, clinging to the faint hope that someone would come looking for me. But as the hours dragged on, that hope began to fade. The desert was eerily silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that carried grains of sand into my eyes. I stumbled, catching myself just before falling face first into the hot ground. My legs wobbled, and my vision blurred. This was it, I thought. This was how my story would end, in a place where no one would find me. And then I heard it. A rhythmic sound, faint but growing louder. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't my heartbeat, I was sure of that. I squinted into the horizon, my breath catching as I saw something moving toward me. A figure, shimmering like a mirage, approached on the back of a camel. The closer they came, the more my heart raced. Was this real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? As the figure came into focus, I saw him. He was unlike anyone I'd ever seen. An Arab man with striking features, his sharp jawline accentuated by the shadow of a beard. His skin was bronzed by the sun, and his dark eyes glimmered with intensity. He wore a long white thobe that seemed to glow against the backdrop of the sand. His camel, a towering, muscular creature, moved with a grace that seemed almost regal. "Are you all right?" he called out in English, his voice deep and commanding, yet filled with concern. I tried to respond, but my throat was so dry that only a croak escaped my lips. He dismounted the camel effortlessly and hurried toward me, his brows furrowed with worry. "Here," he said, pulling a water flask from his belt and holding it to my lips. "Drink." The water was cool and refreshing, like liquid salvation. I drank greedily, my hands trembling as I held onto the flask. "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, his tone both curious and scolding. "I got lost," I admitted, shame washing over me. "I was with a tour group, but I wandered off." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're lucky I found you. The desert is not forgiving." "My name is Ryan," I said, hoping to show some gratitude despite my sorry state. "Zayn," he replied simply, his name rolling off his tongue with a melodic accent. He glanced around, his expression serious. "We need to get you out of the sun. Come with me." Before I could protest, he helped me to my feet and guided me toward his camel. The creature towered over me, its sheer size intimidating. Zane mounted first, then extended a hand to pull me up behind him. My body pressed against his back as we began to move, the camel's steady gait a strange but welcome relief from walking. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes, I couldn't help but wonder where he was taking me. Who was this man who had appeared like a mirage to save me? And why did I feel my heart beating faster every time I glanced at him? The answers would come later. For now, I clung to Zane's steady presence, hoping he was the miracle I desperately needed. The camel's rhythmic stride rocked us gently as the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. The golden dunes were now tinged with a soft orange hue as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. I clung to Zane, my hands gripping the fabric of his thobe as I tried to steady myself. His back was broad and firm, a comforting contrast to the unforgiving wilderness around us. "Where are we going?" I finally mustered the courage to ask, my voice still raspy. "My camp isn't far," Zane replied, glancing over his shoulder briefly. His dark eyes caught the light of the setting sun, making them glimmer like molten gold. "You need food, water, and rest. You won't survive the night out here without shelter." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. The air was cooling rapidly, a stark contrast to the blistering heat of the day. I had read about the desert's extremes, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. The silence between us was punctuated only by the camel's soft grunts and the crunch of sand beneath its massive feet. My mind raced with questions. Who was Zane? Why was he out here, seemingly alone? And how had he found me? But the words caught in my throat every time I opened my mouth to speak. Something about his presence was disarming, making me hesitant to pry. As we crested a particularly high dune, I saw it, a cluster of tents nestled in a shallow valley, their fabric fluttering gently in the breeze. A few camels were tied nearby, their silhouettes blending with the shadows. A small fire burned in the center of the camp, its smoke curling lazily into the sky. Relief washed over me at the sight of civilization, no matter how small. Zane dismounted the camel with ease, then turned to help me down. His hands were strong but gentle as he guided me to the ground. "Come," he said, leading me toward the largest tent. "This is my home, for now." The inside of the tent was simple but comfortable. Colorful rugs covered the sandy floor, and cushions were scattered around in a way that felt inviting. A low wooden table held a teapot and a few small cups, along with what looked like fresh fruit and bread. "Sit," Zane instructed, gesturing to a cushion. I obeyed, my legs feeling like jelly. He disappeared briefly, returning with a small bowl of water and a clean cloth. Without a word, he knelt in front of me and began wiping the dust and sweat from my face. "You didn't have to," I started, but he cut me off. "You're my guest," he said firmly. "And in the desert, we take care of our guests." His closeness was almost overwhelming. I could see the fine lines of his face, the way his dark lashes framed his intense eyes. His scent was earthy and warm, a mix of the desert and something uniquely him. My heart beat faster, and I looked away, unsure of what to say or do. "Why were you out there alone?" Zane asked after a moment, his voice softer now. I hesitated. I wanted to explore, to get away from everything back home." I paused, unsure of how much to reveal. I thought I could handle it, but clearly I was wrong. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The desert tests everyone," he said finally. "It shows you who you are, your strengths and your weaknesses." There was a weight to his words, as if he spoke from experience. I wanted to ask him what the desert had shown him, but before I could, he stood and moved to the table. He poured tea into 2 small cups and handed one to me. "Drink," he said. "It will help." The tea was fragrant and slightly sweet, a welcome warmth in the cooling air. I sipped it slowly, feeling the tension in my body begin to ease. For the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of safety, of hope. But as the night deepened, so did the questions in my mind. Who was Zane, really? And why did I feel this strange pull toward him, this unspoken connection that both intrigued and terrified me? "Rest now," Zane said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." "For what?" I asked. But he didn't answer. He simply gave me a small, almost secretive smile before stepping out of the tent, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts. The night had fallen completely, blanketing the desert in a dark velvet sky dotted with countless stars. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, insignificant compared to the vastness of the universe. I lay on a cushion in Zane's tent, my thoughts tangled with questions about him and where this unexpected journey was leading me. Despite the exhaustion, sleep eluded me. From outside, the faint crackle of a fire and the low murmur of Zane's voice carried through the tent walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped out, drawn by the soft glow of the firelight. Zane was seated by the flames, his profile illuminated in the flickering light. He looked almost otherworldly, his sharp features softened by the fire's glow, yet still radiating strength and intensity. He was speaking to someone. A camel, I realized, tied to a post nearby. His voice was low and soothing, almost as if he were sharing secrets with the animal. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but he noticed me before I could retreat. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his deep voice breaking the stillness of the night. "No," I admitted, stepping closer. "The stars are beautiful, though. I've never seen anything like this." Zane gestured to the space beside him. "Sit. You'll see them better from here." I obeyed, lowering myself onto the sand-covered rug he had placed by the fire. The warmth of the flames was a welcome reprieve from the chill that had settled over the desert. Zane leaned back, his eyes fixed on the sky. "In the desert, the stars remind us of our place, how small we are in the grand scheme of things." I glanced at him, intrigued by the depth of his words. "Do you live out here alone?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. "For now," he replied, his gaze still on the heavens. "I move with the seasons, with the winds. The desert is my home, but it's never the same place twice." There was a sadness in his voice, a loneliness that resonated with me. "Don't you ever feel isolated?" I ventured. He turned to me, his eyes catching the firelight. "Sometimes. But the desert teaches you to rely on yourself, to find peace in solitude." I nodded, understanding more than I expected. Back home, I had felt isolated too, despite being surrounded by people. I had come to the desert to escape that feeling. Yet here it was, staring back at me through Zane's piercing gaze. "Why did you really come here, Ryan?" he asked suddenly, his tone softer now. I hesitated, the vulnerability of the question catching me off guard. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I needed to get away, to find something bigger than myself." Zane studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me. "You found it," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught in my throat. The air between us felt charged, the crackling of the fire a distant hum compared to the pounding of my heart. I wanted to say something, to ask him what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. Zane pulled his hand back, his eyes dropping to the fire. "It's late. You should rest," he said, his tone once again steady and composed. But as he rose to his feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something unspoken but undeniably real. The morning arrived with a fiery intensity, the sun rising over the dunes like a ball of molten gold. I stepped out of the tent to find Zane already awake, tending to the camel and preparing what looked like a small meal. He greeted me with a slight nod, his stoic expression betraying none of the tension that had lingered between us the night before. "Eat," he said, handing me a piece of flatbread and a small bowl of dates. "We have a long journey ahead." "Journey?" I asked, confused. "I'm taking you to a nearby village," he explained. "From there, you'll find your way back to the city." The words hit me harder than I expected. A part of me had assumed, hoped, that I'd stay here longer, learning more about Zane and the life he lived. But before I could dwell on the thought, a gust of wind swept through the camp, carrying with it a low, ominous rumble. Zane's head snapped up, his expression suddenly serious. He scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes narrowing. "A sandstorm is coming," he said, his voice tense. I followed his gaze and saw it, a faint, dark blur on the edge of the desert, growing larger by the second. My heart raced as the reality sank in. I had read about sandstorms, but seeing one approach was something else entirely. "We need to secure the camp," Zane said, already moving with practiced efficiency. He began tying down the tents and gathering supplies, his movements quick and precise. I tried to help, but my clumsy efforts only seemed to slow him down. "Stay inside," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. I retreated to the tent as the wind picked up, whipping sand into the air and stinging my skin. From inside, I watched Zane fight against the growing storm, his figure a silhouette against the swirling sands. Despite the chaos, he moved with a calm determination, his strength and resilience on full display. The storm hit with full force moments later. The tent shook violently, and the roar of the wind drowned out all other sounds. I clung to the fabric walls, praying they wouldn't collapse. Just when I thought the storm would tear everything apart, the flap of the tent opened, and Zane stumbled in, his face covered in sand. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. I nodded, my heart pounding. "What about you?" He shrugged off the question, brushing sand from his thobe. "It'll pass," he said, though his labored breathing betrayed his exhaustion. We sat in tense silence as the storm raged on outside. The air inside the tent was heavy, filled with the scent of sand and sweat. I could feel the heat radiating off Zane as he sat close to me, his presence both grounding and electrifying. "Thank you," I said finally, breaking the silence. "For what?" he asked, his tone guarded. "For saving me," I said, meeting his gaze. "Twice now." Zane's expression softened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It's what anyone would do." I shook my head. "Not anyone." He looked away, as if uncomfortable with the weight of my gratitude. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, and then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. Zane froze, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of our breathing. My heart pounded as I waited for him to pull away, to reject the connection I had so recklessly sought. But he didn't. Instead, he took my hand in his grip firm yet gentle. "Ryan," he began, his voice low and hesitant. Before he could finish, the tent shuddered violently, and a gust of wind tore through the opening, scattering sand across the floor. The moment shattered, leaving us both startled and scrambling to secure the flap. As we worked together to fortify the tent, I couldn't help but steal glances at Zane, his face set with determination. The connection between us had been undeniable, even if it had been interrupted. When the storm finally began to subside, Zane turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Get some rest," he said, his voice steady but distant. I nodded, though sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. As I lay down on the cushions, my thoughts raced with the memory of his touch and the way his eyes had softened when they met mine. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm that felt almost eerie. The desert, once chaotic and alive with fury, now lay still under the pale light of dawn. I stepped out of the tent, the cool air brushing against my skin. Zane was already outside, tending to the camel. His movements were precise, but something about him seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. I approached cautiously, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. "Zane," I began, my voice hesitant. "About last night." He turned to me, his dark eyes unreadable. "There's no need to talk about it," he said, his tone clipped, but the way his hand lingered on the camel's reins told me otherwise. "I think there is," I insisted, stepping closer. "I felt something. I think you did too." For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned to face me fully. "Ryan," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't understand what you're asking. My life here, it's not simple. It's not easy." "Neither is mine," I countered. "But that doesn't mean we should ignore what's happening between us." The tension hung heavy in the air, but before either of us could say more, the distant sound of voices interrupted us. Zane's expression darkened as he glanced toward the dunes. "We need to leave," he said abruptly, grabbing the camel's reins. The strangers turned out to be travelers passing through, but the fear in Zane's eyes lingered long after they were gone. As we prepared to leave for the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back. When we reached the outskirts of the village, Zane stopped abruptly, his hand tightening on the reins. "This is where we part ways," he said, his voice low. "No," I said, stepping in front of him. "I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth. What are you so afraid of?" For a moment, Zane looked as if he might argue. But then, with a deep breath, he reached out and took my hand. "I've lived my life with walls around me," he admitted. "But meeting you, it's made me realize I don't want to be alone anymore." The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and exhilarating. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, pressing my forehead to his in a gesture that felt both intimate and grounding. "You're not alone," I whispered. That night, under the same stars that had witnessed our first moments together, Zane and I allowed ourselves to embrace the connection we had fought so hard to deny. The desert, vast and unyielding, had brought us together in the most unexpected way. What would you do if you found love in the most unexpected of places? This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures lead us not only to new horizons, but also to the depths of our own hearts. Let us know in the comments how you'd handle a situation like Ryan and Zane's. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire, surprise, and move you.